In May 2019, a single line added to a United States Commerce Department list cut Huawei off from American silicon. Every chip, every design tool, every license from American origin suppliers gone overnight. The pressure was meant to come from the outside. It came from the inside of Huawei's own labs instead. That forced inward turn is the first link in a chain that ends years later with a domestic artificial intelligence chip line forecast to claim roughly half of China's accelerator market. 5 links, 1 ban, 1 product line, 1 market forecast, and a competitor that the restriction built. Start with what the Commerce Department actually did in May 2019. The agency added Huawei to what is formally called the Entity List, which is confirmed by the Federal Register amendment published that month. The effect was surgical and immediate. Huawei lost reliable access to chips designed with American tools, manufactured on American licensed processes, or supplied by companies with significant American exposure. Taiwan Semiconductor, the world's most advanced contract foundry, issued a public compliance statement in 2020 confirming it would not fulfill Huawei orders above restricted process thresholds. The smartphone division stalled. The server roadmap stalled. The networking business, which Huawei had spent years building into a global infrastructure presence, suddenly could not count on the silicon it needed to compete at the leading edge. That is the confirmed first link, and it is also where the story stops reading the way Washington intended. What happened next inside Huawei is reported rather than confirmed. No internal budget memo has been made public. No executive has described on the record the precise moment the company decided to treat the ban as a product specification rather than a terminal diagnosis. But the output of that internal decision is visible. Huawei's chip design subsidiary, which it had been building for decades as a provider of custom silicon for its own devices, began redirecting engineering resources. The target shifted away from the consumer chips that needed Taiwan Semiconductor's most advanced nodes and toward artificial intelligence inference accelerators that could, at least in principle, be designed for manufacture on older processes or on domestic foundry capacity that fell outside the American licensing web. This is the link the rest of the chain hangs from. If the engineers had concluded the restrictions were permanent and pivoted to software or services, every downstream link dissolves. That decision is reported. It is also the one the entire story depends on. The Ascend Artificial Intelligence Accelerator line predates the ban as a research program. Huawei announced the Ascend 910 in 2019, roughly concurrent with the Entity List action. What the ban did was convert a research project into a survival imperative. Subsequent generations followed, each one tuned more explicitly for the commercial market, and each one entering production at a moment when the alternative, Nvidia's high-performance accelerators, was becoming progressively harder for Chinese customers to obtain. The United States Bureau of Industry and Security tightened export controls in October 2022 and again in October 2023, restricting sales of Nvidia's most capable training chips to China. Those 2 rounds of controls were not aimed at helping Ascend. They were aimed at limiting Chinese access to frontier computing. The effect, confirmed by product announcements and reported by industry press, was to redirect demand that would have defaulted to Nvidia toward whatever domestic alternative existed. Ascend was that alternative. Here is where the physical reality of the performance gap matters. Third-party benchmark estimates, and these are estimates rather than independently audited figures, place the gap between the Ascend 910B and Nvidia's H100 at somewhere between a factor of 1.5 and a factor of 3, depending on workload. That is not a rounding error. On a rack-scale cluster, that gap translates roughly to the difference between training a large model in a week and training it in 2. That is a serious disadvantage for frontier training runs where every additional day of compute is a cost and a delay. But for inference deployment, running a trained model against live queries at steady state, the gap narrows considerably. That narrowing explains why Ascend's early confirmed commercial wins cluster in inference rather than in frontier training. The product is real. The limitations are also real. Both of those things can be true at once. The fourth link is where the story stops being about one company's engineering choices and starts being about market structure. As Ascend chips entered production workloads, a software ecosystem began forming around them. The software layer that makes an artificial intelligence accelerator useful at scale is not the chip itself. It is the compiler stack, the framework integrations, the operator libraries, the debugging tools, the documentation, the community of developers who know how to use all of it. Huawei's version of that layer carries the name of its compute architecture for neural networks. Deployment of Ascend hardware at Baidu has been reported by Reuters and by the South China Morning Post. Huawei's developer conferences have confirmed partnerships with domestic software teams. State procurement signals, reported but not verified at line item level, indicate government-affiliated research institutions qualifying Ascend hardware for their own stacks. Each quarter of that ecosystem investment raises the switching cost for a Chinese artificial intelligence lab that wants to go back to Nvidia, if Nvidia ever regains access. This is a reported dynamic, not a confirmed one, and the depth of that qualification matters. Qualifying hardware for a workload is not the same as committing future procurement to it. That distinction is the chain's second soft point, and it is worth holding on to. The softest point in the chain is not the chip design, it is the node. The Ascend 910B is reported to be manufactured at Semiconductor Manufacturing International, China's most advanced domestic foundry, on a process that approximates but does not match what Taiwan Semiconductor delivers at comparable lithography generations. Yield data from Semiconductor Manufacturing International at advanced nodes is not public. Independent estimates vary widely. If yield is substantially lower than what Taiwan Semiconductor achieves at equivalent lithography, the cost per working die rises in ways that could make the market share projection structurally optimistic, regardless of how good the chip design is. The chain from band to product is confirmed by public announcements, reported design wins, and visible commercial deployments. The chain from product to durable market dominance runs through yield data that no one outside Semiconductor Manufacturing International has seen, and through the durability of export restrictions that the United States government has already revised twice. If Nvidia finds a compliant path back into the Chinese market through a reclassified accelerator product, the switching cost dynamic in Link 4 could reverse faster than any projection assumes. That possibility is not hypothetical. Nvidia has already introduced export-compliant accelerator variants designed to fall under restriction thresholds, though whether those products satisfy the performance requirements of leading Chinese artificial intelligence labs remains an open question that reported benchmarks have not settled. The ban did not kill Huawei's chip ambitions. Consider the analogy once for the mechanism that is hardest to see without it. A city that imports all its grain from a single distant supplier, cut off by a trade blockade, does not necessarily produce famine. If the city has farmland it has never needed to till, the blockade produces farmers. Huawei had the farmland. Its chip design arm, built over decades, had never needed to operate at full commercial scale because Taiwan Semiconductor was cheaper and faster. The ban handed Huawei a reason to plow. That is a confirmed structural reality about what decades of chip design investment looks like when the external supply chain disappears. The market share projection is where the chain's least certain link lives. Analyst firms covering the China artificial intelligence chip market, including TrendForce among others, have projected Huawei's Ascend line capturing roughly half of China's domestic accelerator market within the next several years. That figure is a forward-looking estimate, not a realized shipping data point. It is directional, not settled. The bullish read is that confirmed products, reported design wins, and structural tailwinds from export controls all point toward durable domestic market capture. The bearish read uses the same evidence differently. Ascend is still a performance tier below the frontier, the ecosystem is still maturing, and yield uncertainty at Semiconductor Manufacturing International is a real ceiling on how fast the market share projection can materialize. Those two reads are not symmetric. The bull case rests on confirmed hardware and reported wins. The bear case rests on the gaps in that same evidence. Whether the chain terminates in parity or in a permanent performance ceiling is a question the next 2 or 3 product generations will answer, not this one. Start in May 2019 with a name added to a list. Follow the engineers who had nowhere to go but inward. Watch the research program become a product line, the product line attract a software ecosystem, and the ecosystem begin to make the question of Nvidia's access to China something other than the only variable. The domestic alternative now exists and is improving each generation. The ban did not kill Huawei's chip ambitions. It funded them, in the only currency that compounds: urgency. The competitor Nvidia now faces in the Chinese artificial intelligence chip market was not built by Chinese industrial policy alone, and it was not built despite the entity list action. Trace the causality carefully and the action is among its primary inputs. That is not irony. It is mechanism. The plan's actual output is the rival. The next cycle will show one of two things. Either Semiconductor Manufacturing International closes enough of the yield gap that Ascend scales to the full market projection, or the gap holds and Huawei's window stays narrow, confined to a protected domestic market rather than a self-sustaining competitive position that can outlast the restrictions that made it. Watch the node, not the announcement. If you track where the chain goes next, yield data, export control revisions, the next Ascend generation, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is the beat this channel stays on.